When I started this project, I intended to record most of the editing that I would do to the map and maybe put it into a time lapse or montage or something. But due to the program proving to be very unreliable on my computer, I decided that today I just do using an old save file, do a rough video on showing how some of the tools work in the editor. Now, recording taxes a computer quite heavily depending on the program that's used, and since this is a pretty powerful program in the sense of its possibilities, performance is already slowed down quite a lot, so it takes longer to render certain things. But I'm going to show off some of the tools, like I said, and apply them to a certain scenario. And the first tool I'm going to use is the Modify Terrain tool. This basically lets me modify all this space around here that is the terrain, and the most common used tool by me is the Flatten tool. So to start with, I flattened out this area to give me an idea of the space the player will be in, and I could then flatten out individual areas such as this road here and down here. Now, I had some experience with the program previous to the beginning of the project, but there's still little things I've been learning along the way, such as using the Flatten tool and defining the height is a really meticulous process because you get things like this. But I found that holding Control and clicking, I can pick the height from a defined area in the terrain, so I get much more controllable results straight away. Using the Flatten tool, however, you get these rough edges around the terrain, which looks unnatural. But holding Shift, I can simply start to drag around and smooth these areas out and make them look natural. To apply these tools to a scenario, I'm going to pick the height down here. I'm going to carve through this area down here and make a little path for a stream. So with my height selected, I'm just going to cut through here. Let's seal this up. Okay, that's good enough to start with. I'm going to hold Shift and click and smooth out the area. I'm not going for a lot of detail here, otherwise I would spend a lot of time on it. Okay, now I'm ready to add my, using the River tool, I'm ready to add some water. The River tool works a lot like the Road tool, in the sense when you click, you get this representation of where the river will be, and you can simply drag it to one end and double click to end it, or you can click and add individual points, which is good if I want to make a very flowing river for such. But for this, we're just going to keep it simple. Double clicking, we finish here, and now I need to assign a material to in the material editor. Go to look for ocean, and these are textures and materials that the developers have included within the editor. So I'm going to click one, assign it, and we have some really shiny water here. So to fix this, there's a lot of parameters here that I can configure the water with, but for this project I generally just turn this down and it looks a lot better already. Like I said, I can play with these a lot and change how the detail. So for example, could start with, it's basically taking an image the developers have mapped to CubeMap. But for this, I'm just going to increase it. Yeah, that's a good start. Another problem we have with this is these big empty spaces here. So to correct this, increase the width to fill this area. And also, I have control of where the river actually is, so I can pick this up here and start to drag this down a bit. And I'm going to, again, the Flatten tool, flatten this area about. Smooth it out. And now we have a very rough stream to play with. To add more detail to this area, I'm going to use the Vegetation tool, which allows me to define groups and add individual items of vegetation to it. So for this, I'm going to use the smaller, and I'm going to define a brush radius of about 6, and I'm going to paint objects. For this I can simply click and drag along, start to add the vegetation that's in the group. I can also just click like this. Because this is all the same vegetation, it's quite repetitive, and there are parameters here such as randomly rotating it and the size variations, but I do find that size and size variation are some of the biggest culprits in regards to causing the editor crash. Now with the vegetation tool still selected, I can pick individual items of vegetation by dragging and dropping, and pick them, move them around. And also, well, rotate works sometimes, more on trees. For this I want to have an open path for the player to walk through, as players can walk through vegetation, but I want to give some encouragement for them to go through a certain specific area, so this will look more, towards the end it'll look more open. Just a bit more detail in here, or variation. Now to further add to this, I'm going to use the vegetation tool to throw down some trees. For trees I like to hold shift, and just simply, oh, these aren't trees. Now these are trees. Shift and click and add trees individually. Again, they have a different defined size and a size variation. It's very subtle, but it's enough to make it that bit more interesting for players, so they won't recognize that they are actually all the same tree model. And add some bushes in here. In fact, I'll paint these on. So their density, about, if I have a very high net density number, it'll paint very few in. It'll require a larger brush radius. Whereas I have a density of 1, it'll fill the whole brush with vegetation. So I'll put that to about 7. And again, I want to select some of these and move them out of the way. Give the player some confidence to move through this area. The frame rate's getting really bad now because of the recording, but and I'll go into the layer painter, which is basically how you texture the terrain. So this is the grass texture, and as you can see, it's a bit much to have it just the same way throughout. Now different variations here, the hardness of the brush and the brightness, so you can have it darker or you can have it lighter. But I generally just stick to the defaults that the developers of the engine included. So for this I'm going to add some pebbles under the water, just texture those in. Because depending on the opacity that I choose for the water, it'll allow the player to see textures and vegetation and rocks and such below. Things like this allow more have more of a visually interesting space for the players to navigate through. Because they're seeing this texture over and over again, they're going to get pretty bored quite quickly. A thing I've noticed when editing is, because I'm always doing this from a bird's eye view, sometimes it's good to come in to the player's point of view and just look how things, see how things will look that way. There's a muddy path here, so that because I don't have hardness set to 1, the textures will blend together a bit better. Okay, now we need a little bridge to go along here, to do this, I'll go into the brush in the objects menu and I'll filter wood. So this will give me a selection of wooden objects that the developers have included as part of the SDK. And for this I'm going to use wooden dock top. And I just simply click and drag this in. And now it's here. And using these tools here, I can allow it to follow terrain and snap to objects, where this just follows the terrain so it would ignore other objects such as this. So I have full control over where this is going. So I can click to drop it here. I can rotate it. I can also resize it. So I can have a really tiny bridge or a huge bridge. For this, I think that'll maybe a bit bigger. Yeah, that'll do the job. So I'm going to bring this down here. I have the vegetation clipping through here, but I don't mind that too much. Okay. A final tool I want to show off is the lightning tool. Now, observe the sun is over here, and this diagram here gives us a representation of the sun's path, as the editor can function on a time of day setting. So the time of day is now set to 15:37. So I can drag this slider along, and you notice that the sun is over. Yeah, the sun's starting to move because I'm changing the time of the day. And with that, the shadows in the environment will also move. So it can, through the editor, you can have a realistic progression of time and lighting. So the player could, in theory, start at night and walk over here, and it would just, as a real day, get brighter and brighter. Or I could script it so that when a player walks down this path and crosses this bridge, the sunset will occur. So I have variables in here, and I also have further variables in the terrain time of day tool. And this is where I can program out a where'd it go? I can program out a full day basically, and I also have these variables here that change everything from the color of the sky to the depth of field, and there's a lot of tools to play with here, but for the most part I'm just going to keep it simple for the sake of this project. That covers just about everything for this video. Hope you enjoyed.